There is a moment that often happens quietly between two people. No announcement, no clear signal, nothing obvious that everyone in the room would notice. And yet something changes. Two people who were simply talking suddenly become more aware of each other. A pause in conversation feels slightly heavier. Eye contact lasts a little longer than usual. The space between them begins to feel different, more charged, more meaningful, and neither person may fully understand why, because what they are experiencing is not simply attraction anymore. It is the moment attraction begins transforming into physical desire, and that transformation is not random. It follows a psychological process that happens deep inside the human brain. A process driven by attention, anticipation, emotional signals, and subtle biological responses. Most people believe physical desire appears suddenly, as if one moment you feel nothing, and the next moment desire is simply there. But the truth is more complex. Desire rarely appears instantly. It builds quietly beneath the surface of interaction, through small psychological triggers that gradually shift the way two people perceive each other. And when enough of those triggers align, the emotional atmosphere between them changes. The mind begins interpreting the presence of the other person differently, not just as someone interesting, but as someone who suddenly feels personally significant, someone whose closeness begins to affect the body as much as the mind. And this shift, this precise psychological turning point, is one of the most fascinating experiences in human relationships, because it reveals how deeply connected our emotions, our thoughts, and our biology truly are. To understand this moment, we must first understand how attraction begins inside the mind, because long before desire appears in the body, it first begins inside attention. Every meaningful attraction begins with attention, but attention alone is not enough. People notice hundreds of individuals every day without feeling anything unusual. They pass by strangers, exchange brief conversations, observe faces without emotional significance. So what makes one person suddenly stand out from all the others? Why does the mind sometimes become unexpectedly focused on someone in particular? Psychologists describe this phenomenon as selective emotional attention. The brain constantly scans the environment for signals that something meaningful might be happening. Sometimes that signal appears through personality, sometimes through body language, sometimes through subtle emotional cues. But when the brain detects a pattern that feels intriguing or rewarding, it begins directing more attention toward that person. And attention is the first step in the development of attraction. When attention increases, awareness increases. You begin noticing small details, the way the other person speaks, the rhythm of their voice, the expressions that appear on their face when they laugh. These details might seem insignificant on the surface, but inside the brain, they activate powerful neurological systems designed to evaluate social connection. The mind begins asking silent questions. Is this person interesting? Do I enjoy being around them? Do they seem interested in me? And every interaction slowly contributes information that shapes the brain's response. At first, this process remains subtle. You simply feel slightly more curious about the other person, slightly more engaged in conversation. But if the interaction continues generating positive emotional signals, something deeper begins happening inside the brain. The reward system becomes activated. Dopamine begins increasing, and dopamine changes the way the mind experiences attention. Suddenly, the other person feels more stimulating, more exciting, more important to notice. This is the stage where attraction begins forming. But attraction alone is still different from desire. Attraction is curiosity. Desire is emotional energy directed toward physical closeness. And the moment attraction transforms into desire occurs when another psychological ingredient enters the interaction. Anticipation. The brain is highly sensitive to anticipation. In fact, neuroscience shows that the anticipation of a rewarding experience often produces stronger neurological activity than the experience itself. This means that when two people sense the possibility of deeper connection, their brains begin reacting even before anything physical has happened. Small moments become emotionally amplified. A brief touch during conversation, a moment where their hands accidentally brush against each other, a pause where eye contact lingers longer than expected. These moments create psychological tension, not tension in the negative sense, but tension in the sense of emotional energy waiting to be resolved. And this tension changes the emotional atmosphere between two people. They begin sensing something unspoken in the interaction, a layer of meaning beneath the words being exchanged. Conversations feel slightly different. Silences carry emotional weight, and both people become more aware of their physical presence around each other. This awareness is the first sign that attraction is transforming into desire, because the brain is no longer focusing only on emotional connection. It has begun associating the other person with physical closeness, and that association triggers another powerful system inside the human mind, the imagination. When attraction deepens, the mind begins imagining possibilities, not consciously at first. Often these thoughts appear briefly and disappear again. But the brain begins exploring potential scenarios. What would it feel like to be closer to this person? What would happen if the connection continued growing? These imagined possibilities activate emotional and biological responses. The brain releases chemicals associated with anticipation and reward. Heart rate subtly increases. Attention becomes sharper. The body becomes more aware of proximity and physical signals. This is the stage where attraction quietly becomes physical desire, because the mind has begun associating the other person not only with emotional curiosity, but with the possibility of physical intimacy. And once that association forms, interactions between the two people begin feeling noticeably different. Every glance, every smile, every moment of closeness carries a deeper emotional charge. But this transformation does not always happen instantly. Sometimes it develops slowly through repeated interactions. Sometimes it appears suddenly in a single moment where emotional signals align perfectly. And when it does appear suddenly, people often describe it as a spark, a moment where the connection between two people suddenly feels unmistakable. Yet even in those moments, the spark is not random. It is the result of many subtle psychological signals that have been building quietly beneath the surface. Signals that the brain has been processing long before either person consciously realized what was happening. Attraction rarely begins with physical desire. Instead, it usually begins with emotional curiosity. Two people notice something about each other that feels engaging, a shared sense of humor, a tone of voice that feels comfortable, a way of speaking that feels genuine. At first, the interaction remains entirely psychological. The mind evaluates personality, communication, emotional signals. But over time, something subtle begins to change. The attention that was once directed toward conversation slowly begins expanding toward physical presence. You become more aware of the way the other person sits, moves, and gestures. Their physical presence begins occupying more space in your awareness. This change happens gradually and often unconsciously, because the brain is designed to constantly evaluate social interactions on multiple levels at the same time. Part of the mind analyzes emotional compatibility. Another part analyzes biological attraction. When these two systems begin aligning, attraction begins deepening. And when they align strongly enough, the mind enters a state psychologists often describe as heightened interpersonal awareness. This means that both people begin noticing each other more intensely than before. A glance across the room suddenly feels meaningful. A brief moment of physical closeness becomes more noticeable. Even silence begins carrying emotional weight, because the brain has begun interpreting the presence of the other person as something significant, not just socially interesting, but biologically relevant. And this is where the transformation from attraction to physical desire truly begins. Inside the brain, attraction and desire are influenced by a conversation between several chemical systems. Dopamine plays a central role. It is the neurotransmitter responsible for motivation and anticipation. When someone feels attracted to another person, dopamine levels increase. This creates excitement, curiosity, and the desire to continue interacting with that individual. But dopamine alone does not create physical desire. For that transformation to happen, another system begins activating as well. The brain starts increasing sensitivity to signals related to physical proximity. When two people feel strong attraction, their nervous systems begin responding more strongly to each other's presence. Heart rate may increase slightly. Breathing patterns can subtly change. Eye contact may feel more intense. None of these reactions are necessarily conscious. They occur because the brain is interpreting the interaction as emotionally and biologically meaningful. In simple terms, the brain begins preparing the body for deeper connection. And this preparation is what people often experience as sexual tension. Sexual tension is not simply physical attraction. It is the moment when psychological curiosity and biological awareness begin merging. One of the most powerful triggers in this transformation is eye contact. Humans communicate enormous amounts of emotional information through the eyes. When two people feel attracted to each other, eye contact often becomes longer and more frequent. But the importance of eye contact goes beyond communication. It also influences the brain's emotional systems. Prolonged eye contact activates neural pathways related to intimacy and emotional bonding. It increases awareness of the other person's presence. It creates a feeling of connection that words alone cannot produce. This is why moments of silent eye contact can feel so intense. Two people may be saying nothing at all, yet the emotional atmosphere between them becomes unmistakable, because the brain recognizes that something significant is happening. And when that recognition occurs repeatedly, the mind begins interpreting the connection differently. The other person is no longer simply someone interesting to talk to. They become someone whose presence affects the body itself. Another powerful factor is proximity. The closer two people are physically, the more strongly their nervous systems begin responding to each other. When someone enters our personal space, the brain automatically becomes more alert. If the person is perceived positively, this closeness can increase emotional excitement. The mind begins noticing subtle details that might otherwise go unnoticed. The warmth of the other person's presence, the rhythm of their breathing, the slight movements of their posture. These sensory signals create a heightened awareness of physical presence. And this awareness slowly changes the emotional tone of the interaction. Conversations may continue exactly as before, but something beneath the surface begins shifting, because the brain has started interpreting the interaction not only as social connection, but as physical connection as well. Eventually, many people experience a moment where the change becomes clear. It might happen during a pause in conversation, during a moment when the two people are standing close together, during a glance that lasts just slightly longer than expected. Suddenly, both individuals become aware that the interaction feels different, more intense, more personal, more charged with possibility, and that realization often arrives silently. No one announces it. No one needs to explain it. Both people simply feel that something has shifted. At that moment, attraction has moved beyond curiosity. It has entered the territory of desire. Because the mind is no longer imagining the connection only emotionally. It has begun imagining it physically as well. The reason this transition feels so powerful is because it combines several psychological systems simultaneously. Attention becomes focused. Anticipation increases. Biological signals activate. Imagination begins exploring possibilities. All of these processes create emotional intensity, which is why the moment attraction becomes desire can feel almost electric. It is not simply a thought. It is a full-body experience. The mind and body responding together to the presence of another person. But this moment is also fragile, because desire often exists in a space where nothing has happened yet. Everything remains possible, and possibility carries emotional power. Sometimes the moment leads to deeper connection. Sometimes the tension fades, but the psychological turning point itself is unforgettable, because it reveals something profound about human relationships. That desire is not simply about physical appearance. It is about the complex interaction between emotion, attention, biology, and imagination. And when all of these forces align, The connection between two people can suddenly feel completely different from anything that existed before. There is a precise moment when attraction stops being purely emotional and becomes something deeper. A moment when curiosity becomes tension, when attention becomes awareness, when the presence of another person begins influencing the body as much as the mind. Psychologists sometimes describe this shift as the transition from social connection to intimate awareness. And what makes this transition fascinating is that it rarely happens through words. It happens through signals. Tiny signals that two people exchange without consciously planning them. A change in tone of voice. A slight shift in body orientation. The way someone leans slightly closer while speaking. These signals are so subtle that most people never consciously notice them. But the brain notices them instantly, because the human mind evolved to read social and emotional cues with extraordinary precision. When two people feel mutual attraction, their bodies begin communicating through these unconscious signals. One person might lean slightly forward. The other mirrors the movement without realizing it. One person's voice softens. The other instinctively responds with the same tone. Psychologists call this phenomenon behavioral synchrony. When two individuals feel emotionally connected, their behaviors begin mirroring each other. Posture aligns. Gestures become similar. Even breathing patterns can subtly synchronize. This mirroring effect creates a powerful psychological signal. It tells the brain that the interaction is not just friendly, but emotionally significant. And when the brain recognizes that significance, the emotional atmosphere between the two people changes. The interaction begins feeling more intense, more personal, more charged with meaning. This is the moment where attraction begins transforming into physical desire, because the brain is no longer simply processing conversation. It is processing connection, and connection triggers deeper biological responses. What makes this moment so powerful is the fact that it often happens without direct acknowledgement. Two people might continue talking normally. They might discuss ordinary topics. But beneath the conversation, another layer of communication is unfolding. A silent dialogue made of glances, pauses, and proximity. This silent dialogue is what creates tension. Not tension in the sense of discomfort, but tension in the sense of emotional energy waiting to be resolved. When attraction becomes physical desire, both individuals begin sensing this energy. They become more aware of the space between them, more aware of how close they are standing, more aware of every small movement. Even silence begins carrying meaning, because silence allows the emotional signals to become more noticeable. Words disappear, but awareness remains. And sometimes awareness alone is enough to transform the emotional atmosphere between two people completely. Interestingly, many psychologists believe that the moment before intimacy often feels more intense than the intimacy itself. This happens because anticipation activates the brain's reward system in powerful ways. When something meaningful is about to happen, the brain releases dopamine. Dopamine heightens focus, excitement, and emotional intensity. It creates the feeling that something important is approaching. But once the anticipated moment actually occurs, the brain begins adjusting. The uncertainty disappears, the anticipation resolves, and emotional intensity naturally decreases. This is why sexual tension can sometimes feel overwhelming. It exists in a psychological space where anticipation remains alive. The moment has not yet happened. Everything still feels possible. And possibility fuels imagination. Imagination fuels emotion. Emotion fuels desire. All of these forces combine to create the powerful sensation people describe as chemistry between two individuals. But chemistry is not magic. It is the result of several psychological processes happening simultaneously. Interestingly, not every attraction evolves into physical desire. Two people might find each other interesting. They might enjoy conversation, but the emotional signals that trigger deeper awareness never fully align. Sometimes the timing is wrong. Sometimes emotional availability differs. Sometimes the interaction simply lacks the subtle tension that encourages anticipation. And without anticipation, desire rarely develops. Because desire is not only about physical appearance. It is about the psychological atmosphere created between two people. An atmosphere where curiosity, emotional openness, and subtle uncertainty exist together. Without that atmosphere, attraction often remains friendly rather than passionate, which reveals something important about human relationships. Desire is not simply about wanting someone. It is about the interaction between two minds responding to each other in a particular moment. And when that moment appears, it can feel incredibly powerful. The moment attraction turns into physical desire is one of the most fascinating experiences in human psychology, because it reveals how deeply connected our minds and bodies truly are. What begins as curiosity slowly becomes awareness. What begins as conversation slowly becomes tension. And eventually, what begins as simple attraction transforms into a powerful sense of closeness between two people. But understanding this transformation reminds us of something important. Desire is not random. Tension, mirroring, anticipation, biological response, and emotional curiosity. When these elements align in the right moment, attraction transforms into something much deeper, something that feels almost electric. Interestingly, not every attraction evolves into physical desire. Two people might find each other interesting. They might enjoy conversation, but the emotional signals that trigger deeper awareness never fully align. Sometimes the timing is wrong. Sometimes emotional availability differs. Sometimes the interaction simply lacks the subtle tension that encourages anticipation. And without anticipation, desire rarely develops. Because desire is not only about physical appearance. It is about the psychological atmosphere created between two people. An atmosphere where curiosity, emotional openness, and subtle uncertainty exist together. Without that atmosphere, attraction often remains friendly rather than passionate, which reveals something important about human relationships. Desire is not simply about wanting someone. It is about the interaction between two minds responding to each other in a particular moment. And when that moment appears, it can feel incredibly powerful. The moment attraction turns into physical desire is one of the most fascinating experiences in human psychology, because it reveals how deeply connected our minds and bodies truly are. What begins as curiosity slowly becomes awareness. What begins as conversation slowly becomes tension. And eventually, what begins as simple attraction transforms into a powerful sense of closeness between two people. But understanding this transformation reminds us of something important. Desire is not random. It is the result of attention, emotional signals, anticipation, and imagination working together inside the human mind. And when those forces align in the presence of another person, the connection between two individuals can suddenly feel different. More intense, more meaningful, more alive. Yet even in those moments, the most powerful part of the experience is often the silence between words. The pause before something happens. The instant where two people recognize that something has changed between them. Because sometimes the most significant moments in human relationships are not the ones we plan. They are the ones we simply feel. And learning to understand these moments reveals something deeper about ourselves. That attraction, desire, and connection are not separate experiences. They are different stages of the same psychological journey. A journey that begins with attention and sometimes ends with intimacy. If this exploration helped you see something new about attraction and human connection, subscribe to Voxlore Audio, because the deeper we understand human psychology, the more clearly we begin to understand the invisible forces shaping the relationships in our lives.